Hi everyone, my name is Neve and you're very welcome to our 5th MakeCode for Microbit webinar. Today I'm joined by Kaylin.
Hi everyone.
And we also have Amanda, Corey and Richard working away in the background to answer any questions you may have. So please feel free, if you get stuck at any stage, to pop a question into the Q&A section. Something else I'd like to say is that you can pop this webinar and pause at any stage. So if you need a little bit more time to find some of the blocks, please don't hesitate to pop the webinar and pause and give yourself a little bit more time. Okay, but first, what do we need to do to get started? Well, as per usual, we're going to go into the web browser. We're going to go to makecode.microbit.org. Okay, and that is going to open up our home page. Okay, and then we're going to click into new project as we do every single week, because every single week we're completing a new project. And I'm going to go down here. I'm going to type in webinar 5, our 5th webinar of the series. Okay, and today I'm going to quickly go through a recap of what we covered last week. So bearing in mind, if you missed last week's webinar, I would advise maybe going to our YouTube playlist, DreamSpace HomeSpace, and watching in on the webinar first, any previous webinars on the Microbit series before joining in today. Okay, so what did we cover last week? Well, last week we were talking all about the radio function that Microbit has built in. Okay, and we talked about how the Microbit can send and receive data using Bluetooth, using the radio function. So the first thing we discussed was how the Microbit can send and receive strings. Okay, so we didn't need the onStart block for that, so I'm just going to bring it over to the recycling bin and empty them there. Okay, now the first thing we needed to do in order to get started is we needed to set our radio group. Okay, so that's our unique group that allows us to send our messages backward and forwards. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is we're going to use the forever block because our radio group number won't change for us once we set it. So I'm going to go down to the radio section and I'm going to pull out the radio set group block and I'm going to embed it in here in the forever block. Okay, and because today is the 27th of April, I'm going to call our radio group 27, or I'm going to set it to group 27. Okay, so that's going to be the number I'm going to use today for our recap, and Kaylin's going to use today when she goes into a little bit more tricky things to do with radio. Okay, so we've set our radio group. Now we need to tell our Microbit or show our Microbit how to send and receive a string. So the first thing we need to do is we need to get our input. So I'm going to use on button A pressed. So I'm going to get it in my inputs and I'm going to bring my on button A pressed block out. Okie doke. Okay, so now I've got my input. I need it to figure out how to send the string using the radio function. So I'm going to have a look in the radio section and I see on radio received number. So we're not talking about number just yet. We're talking about sending a string. So received name and value, received string. Okay, so I'm going to pull this out here. Okay, so they're the 3 main blocks that we need. Okay, but at first we need to send our string. Okay, so we need to tell our Microbit what we'd like to send. Okay, so here I need to look for a send string and embed it into my on button A press. So I'm going to go back to the radio section and see if I see any block that I can embed into my input that says send string. Okay, and down here I have a radio send string. So like last week, I'm going to pull it out and embed it in here on my on button A pressed and let go of it. Okay, so now I've told my Microbit that when I press button A, I want to send a string, but I haven't inputted what string I want to send. So I have to type something in. And a string is a set of characters, so it can be letters or exclamation marks, that kind of thing. So let me think. Well, I'm going to look outside and see what kind of weather we have today. So down here in Leitrim, it's quite sunny. So I'm going to input sunny as my string. Okay, I'm going to click out. So now I've set my radio group. I've told my microbit what string to send. So I wanted to send Sunny. However, it doesn't know what string to show or to display because all I have shown it is when it receives a string, the received string, and then I've left it blank. So something needs to go in here. So if you want, you can pop the webinar and pause. And if you joined us last week, I want you to think back and see, remember if you can figure out what went in here last week. Okay? Okay, so as most of you will remember, we went up here and we pulled out our show string block from our basic section. Okay, and we embedded it in here. Okay, so now on radio received, so when the radio receives the signal of the received string, it will show string hello. Okay, but that doesn't really make sense because then it would say hello and not Sunny. Okay, and that's not really what we wanted to do because we wanted to show Sunny because we're sending a message from one microbit to the other microbit. So if you can remember back to last week, Kaylin emphasized that we need to pull down our received string and embed it in here where hello is. Okay, and then we let it go. So now our radio, when it receives the received string, will show the received string, which is the string that we sent when we pressed button A. So let's test it out and see if that works. So I'm going to press A and that will hopefully make our second microbit appear. Excellent, and we've seen something happen up here with the antenna, so we've seen it light up. Okay, so now I'm going to have a try again. So I'm going to press A and hopefully the string that I want to send will be received on our second microbit. So let's have a try. Press A here. Great. So our second microbit is displaying Sunny. Excellent. Okay, so that was the first thing we covered last week. The next thing we covered last week was how to send a number. Okay, and it was quite similar to show string. However, there was a couple of little things that we had to do differently and different blocks we needed to use. So I displayed how to show a string using the radio function. Now I'm going to show how to show a number or how to display a number using the radio function. So I'm going to need a new input because I'm going to leave my string there. So I'm going to use on button B pressed instead. Okay. So I have to change it on button B, otherwise there'll be a bug in the block. So I need to debug that in order to get it to work. Okay, so now I have to go back and I have to look for something similar to this, but instead of radio send string, I want it to say radio send number because we're going to send a number this time. Okay, so my very second block, radio send number. I'm going to pull it out and drag it out and embed it into on button B pressed. Okay, now I could just type in my age or the date, or I could type in any number I wanted, but Kaylin showed us a really cool way of using the numbers function last week. So Kaylin showed us how to display temperature because Kaylin went through that the microbit has built-in sensors, such as the antenna for the radio function. Okay, so in input, there's a couple of different things we can use that display numbers. So temperature was the one that Kaylin showed us last week. So I'm going to go with compass heading because I know the compass heading or the direction we're facing, the microbit is facing is going to be shown using a number. So I'm going to see if that will embed in here. Excellent. Okay, so now let me review my code. So I have my radio group set, and then I have on button B pressed send radio number, which will be whatever direction the microbit is facing. However, I haven't told my microbit what to do once it receives the number. So looking at this block for the received string, we're looking for something similar, except for instead of received string, we're looking for something that's going to say received number. So we're going to go back to our radio section. And over here, I see on radio received number. So I'm going to drag that out. Okay, I'm going to pull them down so that they're not as that close to the string so that we can see that they're separate. Okay, so now I want to tell my microbit number 2 that once it receives a number, to show the number it received. Okay, so we're going to go back up to basics. We're going to drag out our show number block and embed it in here on our on radio received number. And again, I could type in any number here, but that wouldn't really work because it wouldn't show us the number that we received. It would only show us a number that we typed in. Okay, so we need to click on our received number up here and drag it in, embed it into that block. So now, when the radio receives the received number, it will show the received number, which will hopefully be the direction that microbit 1 or the sender microbit is facing. Okay, so let's have a try of that. So I'm going to press button B. Hopefully that will enable our second microbit to pop up again. And again, I'm pressing button B to send our number. So let's have a try. Okay, and it says microbit A, or the sender microbit, is facing 90 degrees from north. Okay, so that's interesting.
Yeah, Niamh, I was going to ask you there. I just see a question. I know we usually leave questions to the end, but this one's a good one when you have it up on the screen. Which microbit's compass heading are you actually seeing there? Are you seeing it from the blue one or the yellow one? So the sender or the receiver microbit?
That's an excellent question, and that's a really good point to highlight at this point of our webinar. Okay, so I have my blue microbit here and my yellow microbit underneath. So my blue microbit is my sender microbit. So I'll call it microbit A here. And my bottom microbit, my yellow microbit, I'll call it microbit B. It's my receiver microbit, okay, in terms of the radio function. So the code that we see is displayed on our receiver microbit. So the code that picks up the data, or that is used for the compass heading, is our sender microbit, because it needs to read the data before it sends it. So it's coming from microbit A, or it's coming from the blue microbit, because that's our sender microbit. So it'll read the information, see what direction it's facing, and then it will send it over to the second microbit, which is our yellow one, and it'll only display it. Okay, so that's really it for now on the recap. I'm going to pass you over to Kaylin, and Kaylin is going to delve a little bit deeper into the radio function on the microbit. So over to you, Kaylin.
Perfect, thanks, Niamh. So that was a quick recap on what we did last week, and we got through so much code last week, and we're going to be building on that today. So do remember what Niamh said at the beginning of the webinar today, that if you need to put it on pause at any point, please do. So I'm going to tell you at different points to put it on pause and get caught up and do that, and also be creative and put your own little twist on the code that you're sending as well. So let's think back to exactly what we did last week. Just what Niamh went through there. We went through how to send a number and how to send a string, and how to receive both as well, which is really interesting. But then last week, we asked you to try and come up with a way that you could use this code in real life. And I saw in the Q&A section there that some people had some really cool ones with compass headings and such. So we're going to try and think of that today. So we want to use microbit in a real way. And we want to try and use microbit to make the world a better place, or try and help the world out in a little way. So I'm going to talk about something that we did in our STEAM series last Thursday. So if you do want to watch that, you can see it on our Wakelet, go to the playlist and watch last week's episode. And we spoke about earthquakes and natural disasters. And in that episode, we built a tower that could withstand an earthquake. So why don't we try and think about how we could use microbit and the radio function to add to this build and try and even improve it to make it even safer for the people that live in these countries. So let's have a look at this. So I'm going to click into microbit like I usually do, and I'm going to click into new project. Okay, so let's think of exactly what we want to do? We want to get our microbit to be something that's helpful. So what could be helpful in an earthquake? Well, maybe an alarm of some sort. So we want to try and turn microbit into an alarm so that people would know if there was an earthquake and they could get prepared if they heard this alarm go off. So let's think about this logically and break it down into little pieces. So the first thing that we always have to do is exactly what Niamh said earlier, is we need to get rid of the on start block, and then we need to tune into the correct channel. So we need to tune our microbits into the correct group. So I'm going to set my group to 27, just like Niamh recommended earlier on, which is a really good idea, actually, Niamh, to put it as the date, so it's something we'll remember. Okay, so set my group. Now, I want my microbit to set the alarm off when an earthquake hits. So Niamh, what happens when an earthquake hits? What could trigger this alarm to go off?
Okay, well, when an earthquake occurs, generally the ground tremors or shakes if the earthquake is strong enough for humans or animals to feel it. So generally, how we notice if an earthquake is occurring is if the ground is shaking or tremoring.
Okay, really good. And then we know that microbit has a sensor in it that can sense if someone shakes it. So we got that block, I think one of our first or second weeks, from input. And in there we can see on shake. Okay, so now when our microbit shakes, something's going to happen. But what do we want to happen? We want our microbit to trigger an alarm, so to set an alarm off on our other microbit, on the receiving microbit. So I want you to pause the webinar now and try and figure out how you could finish out this code and turn microbit into an alarm. But I'm going to go through it now. Okay, so we know with radio that we can send numbers and we can send strings. But I want my microbit to send something that will trigger something else. I don't want it just to say, I don't want to just send something. I want it to be a little bit more complicated with our code. So I'm going to send a number, and you'll see why in a second. So I'm going to send 1. Okay, so now when our microbit shakes, it's going to send the number 1. Okay, but what if the alarm is going off and someone wants to turn off the alarm? So usually on an actual alarm, there's a way for someone to disarm it, so to turn it off when it's going off if the earthquake has ended, or maybe if the earthquake isn't that dangerous because it's not that strong. So how we could do that is we could go into input and have one of our buttons as a way to turn off the alarm or to tell the other person that everything's okay, it was only a little earthquake, there's no need to worry. So I'm then on button A, I'm going to send number 2. Okay, so now what my microbit is doing is when it shakes, it sends number 1. When you press button A, it sends number 2. But the receiving microbit doesn't know what to do. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is we need to tell our receiving microbit to actually listen out for these numbers, because right now our second microbit is just going about their day not listening. So we need to tell them to actually listen out for these numbers. So last week we did that, and Niamh went over this earlier. We went into on radio received number. Okay, so right, when we receive a number, what do we want it to do? Okay, let's think about this logically. Let's think about the exact steps that we want our microbit to do. We want our microbit to receive the number, and then we want it to look at what the number is, and if it's a 1, then it sets off the alarm. And if it's a 2, it says everything's okay. So Niamh, what does that sound like? That sounds like some coding concept we've done before. What does it sound like?
Well, it sounds like the if, then, else statements we use. So the conditional statements. And I think we got them in the logic section before.
Okay, so really good idea. So we went into the logic section and we grabbed one of these conditionals. So like Niamh said, the conditional sections are if-then statements. So if something happens, then you do something else. If something happens, so if it's sunny outside, you wear sunglasses, else you don't wear sunglasses, okay? So I'm going to bring in on radio received here, okay? So when my microbit receives a number, okay, so what exactly do I want my microbit to do again? So pause the webinar now. If you know what the step is, go ahead. If not, have a think about it for a second. So we want our microbit to say, if the received number is a 1, then the alarm goes off. If it's a 2, then you can turn the alarm off. You can say everything's okay. So we've used these blocks before, and I found them in the logic section. So we have these comparison blocks. So it can slot in there. So now we're saying if 0 equals 0. That still doesn't sound too good. So we want to say if the number received. So we can use this variable and bring it down here. So now we're saying if the received number is equal to, so if that's what the number is, a 1, then the alarm can go off. Else, you can switch it. Okay, switch it off. So now we have our code. Now we need to decide what our alarm is actually going to be. So we had a few questions last week, and I actually saw that someone asked it earlier on today as well. Can you send music? Can you send icons or different things like that? The answer is no, you can't actually send an icon, but you can get the receiving microbit to show an icon if it receives a number. So you could code it to say, if it receives number 1, it shows a smiley face. If it receives number 2, it shows a sad face. So we can do that today. We can actually say that if it receives a number 1, I'm actually going to get it to play a melody. So to actually sound like an alarm. And I'm going to do this sound. Okay, so now, but the thing is that's not accessible. So that isn't suitable for everyone. So I want everyone to know that this alarm's going off. So I have something that you can hear. I'm going to get something that you can see now as well. So I'm actually going to put in a string and say, help. Okay, so now my microbit is saying, when it receives the number 1, the sound is going to go off, and then it's going to say, help. Okay, but we haven't told it what to do if it receives number 2. So I'm going to put in an icon, and I'm going to say a smiley face. Okay, so now with our code, we're saying, if it receives a number that's 1, the alarm will go off. If else, it'll show a smiley face to say that everything's okay. Okay, so let's test out our code. So the earthquake is coming. We need to shake our microbit to show that the earthquake is coming. You can see that the sound went off and we got help. Okay, the alarm's going off. But now we need to turn off the alarm. We need to say everything's okay. The earthquake's over. Don't worry. Everything's okay. We press button A and we see our smiley face. So that seems like it worked really well. And I'm really proud of you at home if you got that far, because that's a lot of code to get through. Okay. So we did something there using our numbers and receiving numbers. And we did something that could help people's lives in different countries. But let's try and come up with something that we could use on a daily basis. So something that we could actually, something that could actually be really useful for us. And why don't we try and use something where we're sending strings and receiving strings? Okay, so I want to start fresh with this one. I'm going to save this project and I'm going to call it Earthquake. So if I ever wanted to use this code again, I have it. So I typed in Earthquake and I'm going to hit save. Okay, and then I can save it onto my computer there with the instructions that pop up. I'm going to go home. You can see that there's my Earthquake project, it's saved, but I want to go to a new project. Okay, so let's think of something that we could use microbit for on a daily basis. So I know that something I do around the house is I make a lot of cups of tea, and it might be nice to be able to put the kettle on, go and continue working on the webinars, and then know that the kettle went off without having to be close to it. So why don't we create something at home that could help you if you are making a cup of tea for someone at home, because we all love our tea, that if you have the microbit beside you when you're watching the webinars or you're working on your home challenges, that it'll go off and it'll tell you when the kettle has boiled. Okay, so let's think about this here. We want microbit to only send the message that the kettle is boiled when the temperature reaches a certain point. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Okay, what's the first thing we always do? Just going to make it a bit bigger. There we go. So the first thing we always do is we get rid of on start. We don't need on start. And then the next thing we do is we tune into the correct channel. So go into radio, set group, and I'm going to do group 27 again. Okay, so I want you to pause the webinar now, try and figure out what we could do next. Okay, so we want microbit to only send the message if it reaches a certain point. Niamh, what coding concept do you think we could use again here?
Well, we could use the conditionals. So we could use our logic block if then else.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so we could use the logic block again here. So we can see that conditionals are actually very, very useful in coding. So, okay, now what I'm saying is forever, so this is constantly happening. The radio is tuned in to the correct camera, tuned into the correct group, then if true else. So what exactly do I want to say? I want to say that if the temperature is equal to a certain temperature, certain heat. Okay, so we've seen these blocks before. Logic, and I think I've seen them. Okay, yeah, so earlier on we used this equals to one, but we haven't used this one before. So if I bring that one out, you can see that there's greater than or equals to ones. Okay, so I want to use greater than. Okay, greater than or equal to. So this sign means that if it is greater than or equal to the number that it receives from the temperature, then it can set off the alarm to say that the kettle's okay. Okay, so Niamh, where did we find temperature last week actually?
Well, temperature is one in the input section because it's one of the sensors that our microbit has. So it takes in information for the environment for the microbit. So they're found in inputs.
Okay, so that's a really good point because it actually takes in information from the outside. So I scroll down and I can see temperature here. So now if the temperature is greater than or equal to, Niamh, what number can we put in here? What's the temperature that we could put in to know that the kettle has boiled?
Well, generally, I think boiling point is 100 degrees Celsius. Am I correct in saying that, Kaylin?
Yep, I think you are. So I think we can say 100s, because that is when water starts to boil. So when the temperature is greater than or equal to 100, then what do we want to happen? Okay, so we want to have our microbit let us know that the kettle is boiled. So we've sent numbers before. Let's send strings this time. Okay, so radio send string, and I'm going to say ready. Okay, nice and easy, nice easy word to remember. So now, if the temperature is greater than or equal to 100, then it sends the string ready. If not, so if it's not ready yet, then what do we want to happen? We said we wanted to send string, so let's just send another string. And I'm going to say, nope. Okay, so nope, not ready yet. Okay, so that code looks good, but we're missing a piece to what we have to do whenever we use radio. We're missing something. Okay, so pause at home and try and figure out what are we missing here and try and fix the code yourself. So, okay, we don't have our receiving microbit listening out for anything. So all this code is going on, but no one's tuned in to the correct channel yet and listened out for anything. So we need to tell our microbit to listen out. And we sent strings there. So that means that it needs to be listening out for words. So it needs to be listening out for strings in coding. Okay, so now we're listening out for the strings, and we can do the same as we did last week and we went over earlier on. We can just get it to show string. Okay, and bring down that variable, that red one there. So now it's saying, whenever it receives a word, it's going to show whatever the word is. Okay, so we can see over here that we're saying nope, okay, because it hasn't reached 100. Okay, wait, I found a problem though. Neve, what's wrong here? I can see, why can't we get it tested out to see if it'll work with boiling water?
Well, the problem I reckon is that we're using the virtual microbit, Kaylin. So the virtual microbit, it has a default temperature of 21 degrees Celsius because it isn't using the actual sensor to read the temperature. Whereas if we had a real microbit, it would have the built-in sensor or the built-in thermometer, so it would be able to read the temperature. So when we're using the virtual microbit to read temperature, it will always default to 21 degrees Celsius.
Okay, so that's a really good point there. And if any of you noticed that at home as well, good job. Okay, but I want to test out my code to see if my code's going to work. And I don't have 2 microbits to download it. I only have 1. So I want everyone at home, I want you to put your thinking caps on. We're going to do some critical thinking now, and we're going to problem solve. So how can we test out this code on our simulator if it can only go to 21 degrees? Okay. Oh, how about we change our 100 to 21? Because right now we know that if the temperature is lower than 100, so if it's not boiling yet, it's going to say nope, because 21 is less than 100. But why don't we test it out for 21 degrees? Okay, perfect. So now it's saying ready. So now we know that our code works. And if you did have 2 microbits and you were able to download this code onto your microbits, that our code would work. So that's actually really, really cool. We found out today how we would be able to use microbit in real life and how in one way we'd actually be able to almost save people's lives. And in another way, it can also just help us around the house in doing something. So you should be really, really proud of yourself because that's a lot of code that we got through today. So I'm going to pass you on to Neve now, who's going to talk us through the home challenge, which is really, really cool today as well. And also go over a little bit of what we learned and everything that we did.
Thanks, Kaylin. Okie doke. So we're going to go through what we covered today. So we've done a quick recap of last week, which included going over radio. And radio allows us to send and receive data, such as strings and numbers, using Bluetooth, because it has a built-in antenna. Okay? We also covered conditional statements. For example, if the ground shakes in the terms of an earthquake, play an alarm, else do not play an alarm, or play nothing. Okay, so we gave the microbit a choice there using the if then else statements. Okay, and the last thing we covered was using the microbit in real life contexts. For example, an earthquake, so that the microbit was able to help in a real life situation. So if we did program the microbit to pick up if the ground tremored or shook, then it would notify us by playing an alarm so that we'd know that the ground had just shook or tremored. Okay, so well done, everyone. Okay, so now I'm going to go through the home challenge for this week. So this week's home challenge is a really, really interesting and topical one. Okay, so I want everyone to imagine that you are a nurse and you have a really hectic work schedule, just like all nurses have currently. Okay, so you have to imagine yourself as a nurse with a really busy schedule and lots of patients to look after. And then I want you to try and create a device using your microbit, the radio function on your microbit, and the conditional statements which we looked at today to notify you if one of your patients were to fall over or maybe fall out of bed. Okay, so use your microbit, the radio function, and conditional statements, the if, then, else block, to come up with a device that will notify you, the nurse, if one of your patients were to fall over or to fall out of bed, for example. So that's a really interesting home challenge. I'm really looking forward to seeing how you all get on with that one next week. Okay, so I'm just going to have a quick look at the Q&A section and see if we have any interesting questions. I see one here. Kaylin talked about boiling point and using the microbit in a real life context with a kettle. Is the real microbit waterproof? Okay, I'll direct that one at Kaylin. So is the microbit waterproof, the real microbit, Kaylin?
Okay, so good question. And no, the microbit actually isn't. So I wouldn't recommend putting it inside your kettle to test and see if it reaches 100 degrees. But you could leave it beside your kettle or find a way of building something that could actually sit on your kettle or near your kettle to be able to read the temperature.
Thanks, Kaylin. I see another question here. I have a real physical microbit. How can I play my messages on it?
Okay, so yet again, a really good question here. So for radio, you'll have to have two microbits. So you need the sending microbit and the receiving microbit. And you need to download your code onto the microbit by hitting download, saving it onto your computer, and then bringing it onto the microbit when it's connected to your computer. So you do need to have two microbits for it to work, and then you can just download it following the instructions when you hit download, save the code to your computer, and then bring it on over.
Okay, and I see one last question, Kaylin. Is there a limit to how many microbits can be in the same radio group?
Okay, so there actually isn't. So you can have loads of different microbits in the same radio group, but the only thing is, the more you have, sometimes it gets really confused and all of the microbits are looking for this code and the signals. So we wouldn't recommend having loads on it because sometimes the microbit can get a bit confused, but you could have a few. So maybe you could have like 3 or 4 on it and then it wouldn't get that confused.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that, Kaylin. So that's all the questions for now. Well done. I see every week I see an increase in the amount of questions. So I'm really happy to see all the questions coming in today. So thanks a million for taking part today. We've covered loads and loads of coding concepts in this series to date. And one thing I would like to mention is next week's MakeCode for Microbit webinar will be on Tuesday instead of Monday. And the reason for that is next Monday is a bank holiday Monday. Okay, so next week's MakeCode for Microbit webinar will be on Tuesday, and it will be at an amended time. So it won't be at 1 p.m. Instead, it will be at noon. So it'll be at 12 p.m. Okay, so if you're joining us next week, please join us on Tuesday at 12 p.m. Okay? So thank you so much for joining in today, everyone. And if you do want to have a look at some of our previous webinars, or if you want to have a look at some of our previous home challenges, please visit the link on screen now. Okay, that's all from us today. Bye.
Bye.